It's always nice to see friends and colleagues and neighbors, and new faces, so welcome. My name's Gretchen Grobel. I'm Radnor Conservancy's Executive Director, and along with the help of many interns over the past 3 years, I have tried to the Conservancy has tried to raise awareness about best practices around recycling, like don't bag your recycling, your residential recycling, and keep it loose. Don't bag it, keep it loose. And a message from Republic Services direct from them is empty, clean, and dry. That's what they want to see when it comes to them. So our actions have consequences. So I ask you guys to think twice about purchasing water bottles or drinks in plastic containers, or bagging groceries in plastic. I did bring a couple of props, but I know you guys have these, so, everyone has a closet full of these, so it's a great alternative. So I'm going to keep my comments brief, and I just wanted to introduce Jenny Kreitler. She was a co-founder of Radnor Conservancy, and she's going to introduce our speaker this evening. So thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen, and thank you all for coming tonight. We appreciate it. It's not the nicest night, and it's going to be colder tomorrow, so glad we're all here tonight, but really appreciate you being here tonight. I'm Jenny Kreitler. I'm with the Radnor League of Women Voters. We're pleased to be able to offer you this program tonight and to have the co-sponsorship of the Conservancy, of Radnor Ready for 100, as well as the township. So thanks to our partners in helping us get the word out on this tonight. Our league was able to bring our speaker here tonight, who comes to us from out of state and brings her expertise on the subject. We were able to do that through funding from the state of Pennsylvania's League of Women Voters Education Fund. For the last year, the Pennsylvania League has been sponsoring educational events like this and other activities focusing on the problem of plastics in the environment. So far, over the last year and a half, there have been events held in 12 counties from western Pennsylvania up through the Lehigh Valley. We're one of the few in southeastern Pennsylvania, although we have some sister league members here who donated the posters, having made those in one of their earlier events. There's a brochure that I gave out to all of you that was put together by the League of Women Voters of Indiana County. They produced that booklet, and a lot of their interest in the plastics issue derives from the fact that the shale gas industry is heavily impacting their part of the state, so you'll see that reflected in that booklet. I also want to draw your attention to the recycling guidelines flyer that we passed out. For anyone who's not intimately familiar with the details of Radnor recycling do's and don'ts, take a look at that. The primary takeaway point at this point in time, as Gretchen mentioned, is don't put plastic bags in your recycling.
Or don't put your recycling in a plastic bag.
Because it will be put in the trash waste stream and it won't get recycled at all. Before we get started and before I introduce the speaker, I want to just show you a couple figures. I hope you can get the sense of that. I don't expect you to read the numbers. This shows the cost to Radnor Township for trash and for recycling. And the trash is in the orange on the top and the recycling is in the blue on the bottom. And what you can see from those figures, those show total annual costs to the township for each of those activities. And what you'll see is that while the trash costs did go up a bit, they've not gone up dramatically. In contrast, the recycling costs are rising quite steeply. We didn't even have to incur a cost if you go back 5 years or so. So it's a new budget concern for our township. There's going to be discussions as we figure out the budget for the coming year, and I think there's going to be some serious rethinking about the recycling program here. So some of the ideas that'll be discussed tonight for what each of us can do will be all the more important. Those two figures show you the charges per ton, and what has happened in the last year is for the first time we're seeing it's more expensive to get rid of a ton of recyclables than it is to get rid of a ton of trash. So this is the dynamic behind the township's consideration of what they're going to do with the recycling program. So with that, and we will come back to that, I'm sure, in future township meetings. With that, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. And let me just say, in terms of, there will be time for question and answers at the end, so I'll ask you to please hold your questions until Lisa's done speaking to us tonight. Our speaker tonight is Lisa Ann Hamilton. She is an attorney, an environmental advocate who leverages the power of law to accelerate climate action, environmental stewardship, and sustainable development. She is the former director of the Climate and Energy Program for the Center for International Environmental Law, CIEL, and was the lead author of CIEL's Plastic and Climate Report, there it is, about the role of plastic as a contributor to climate change. Earlier, she was a regulatory consultant for the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. She currently works with a global network of attorneys and activists to close the information gap about the risks and due diligence practices of fiduciaries concerning environmental risk. Her publications and speaking engagements communicate the emerging challenges of climate change, plastic pollution, and the jurisprudence of climate litigation as articulated by state and federal courts, as well as international governing bodies. The League has been tapping her repeatedly in recent months to speak to folks all around the state, and we're very pleased to bring her here to Radnor Township this evening. Lisa.
So thank you all so much. First I want to say thank you so much, Gretchen and Ginny. Radnor, both Township and Conservancy have been so gracious in having me here today, so thank you. And I really appreciate all of you being here because this is one of the uglier nights of the year, I think. And I will do my very best to make this worth your while. I would love a show of hands though, just so I get a sense of who's here this evening. Actually, I think I might. Is this on? Okay. Is that? Okay, here we go. Yeah, I just want to make sure everybody can hear me. So who is currently in school right now? High school, elementary school, college people? Great, thank you. Thank you very much. You guys really are a leading force in future activity. You play such a big role in what's happening next environmentally. Any teachers in here? Any else? Teachers? Excellent. Thank you for your service. Actually, I will also say any veterans in here. We have Veterans Day coming up, so thank you for your service to this country. And scientists. Do we have any scientists? Oh, fantastic. Okay, I know I got to be on my toes for you all, particularly. So again, thank you for being here, and I just want to kind of give you a little bit of an overview about who I am, where I'm coming from, and some of the work we did on plastic as part of CIEL. CIEL is an international organization. We're based in Washington, D.C. We're a group of lawyers. We work both on U.S. and global governance issues related to environmental degradation. So I left there in August, but right after we finished publishing this piece, Plastic and Climate. And what we realized that with the 8 million metric tons of plastic that goes in the ocean every year, it is an astounding amount, and it is having an astounding impact on pretty much every aspect of environmentalism. We typically see ocean plastic. You see the downstream impacts, but we realize we really need a much more life cycle approach. We need a much more holistic approach. It starts with how do we use plastic, this incredibly persistent material, all of the fantastic qualities that make it incredibly durable, incredibly lightweight are the very same characteristics that make it persistent in the environment as well. So I want to just talk a little bit about some of the life cycle issues of plastic. I want to talk a little bit about some of the concerns when we talk about environmental and climate degradation. We're not talking only about the downstream. We're talking about beginning in Western Pennsylvania, as Ginny mentioned, with fracking. Pretty much 80, 90% of plastics come from fossil fuels. And by virtue of the incredible cheap shale gas boom here in the United States, it's become a fantastic source of feedstocks or base materials for plastic. And so when you see increased fracking, increased infrastructure on fracking, and you see all of the impacts that come in terms of the production of plastic, you realize that the degradation we experience occurs at many different levels and stages. So I'm gonna, let's see here, get started with the presentation here. And did our IT? No, it's okay. I think so. I think I just got to get the right. Here we go. Okay. Should I start here? Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Okay, and then. Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you. Okay. So as I said, just to sort of get a sense of use. As Jenny mentioned, questions we'll welcome questions till the end if you could just remember them for me. I do want to, many of you have probably already seen these pictures and heard about some of these statistics. We look at the concern that 300 million metric tons of plastic estimated, recorded, that's that 8 million per year since the start of really use of plastics in the 1950s. And now by 2050, by some estimates, there's concern that we will have as much plastic as fish by weight. And as many of you know, 2050, that's just three decades from now. If we do not change the way in which we consume plastic, use plastic, and manage its waste. The picture in the bottom right-hand corner is taken from the Philippines. And we'll get into a little bit about the way in which there was a tremendous opportunity for trade of plastics for emerging countries like China, the ability to take raw materials and give them a second life. That secondary market was enabled to meet the needs of a rapidly growing economy. But the environmental degradation has exceeded the scale and rate with which they can manage plastic, because some of the materials come, they take what was good, and what is no longer useful becomes part of the waste stream, and unfortunately, in bodies of water in Southeast Asia. So I just want to highlight this slide here because I want to highlight, as I'm going along, some of the really good work of environmental organizations that I had the pleasure of working with. This is Ocean Conservancy. Some of you may know or be familiar with their work. They do an annual cleanup every year. And if there's an opportunity for you all to participate or donate your time, or you know some young people who, it's good exercise in terms of illustrating the ways in which everyday items that we use end up in our shores. I have a colleague who works in Hawaii, and every time there's a storm, you see everything from Trader Joe bags to plastic bottles to the bottle tops. And so people are really looking for ways to how can we connect people to our waste, to the 8 million metric tons. People find toothbrushes. I mean, everything you can possibly manage that is plastic ends up in our waterways. I really want to congratulate the League for making recycling such an important issue. There are ways in which we've got to change the conversation we have about waste. There is no such thing as a way with plastics. It is so persistent. It remains in the environment. There's such a need to address how do we use everyday materials? How do we, things like plastic bags. You have something that has a useful life for maybe 10, 15 minutes that becomes part of the environment for decades, infinitely. This particular slide here from the EPA shows the way in which the contrast between the top line, the volume of plastics that have been generated since 1960, with the bottom line being the rate of recycling. We use far more plastics than we do recycle them. And if we're going to continue to have meaningful in a relationship with our environment, we need to get a grip on how we manage our waste, how we use products, and our ability to reuse products in a different way. So as I mentioned before, the shale boom across the United States has really fueled the petrochemical boom in this country. And there is an excitement about how can we use this abundantly cheap natural resource. And the American Chemistry Council, which is one of the leading affinity groups for the petrochemical industry, since 2010 has said that we know about 333 new or proposed petrochemical facilities. Now, not all of those are connected to single-use plastics. Some of them make fibers, some of them make additives. There's a whole range of projects and outputs and products, but primarily we're seeing this is a huge boon for infrastructure that will sustain the production of plastic rather than turn things around and increase reuse and other projects. So in the Ohio River Valley, in concern, again, connected to the abundance of, and I'm sorry that slide is a little bit blurry, but it's the Marcellus Shale for its huge amount of shale gas resources. What you see here in this slide are the series of infrastructure projects. I believe there are 137 of them projected for the Ohio River Valley. So you've got the extraction, natural gas, so all of the fracking wells. Then you have the processing plants for those, the fractionators. They separate the natural gas into its component parts. The storage hub, this one in particular, there's a huge Appalachian storage hub currently being planned. As somebody who works on climate, it was interesting to see the Department of Energy's commentary that the benefit of having an Ohio River Valley petrochemical complex was to counteract the fact that the Louisiana and Texas Gulf region are becoming increasingly climate unstable. So this would be a plan B for the difficulties they're having with sea level rise and other climate-related impacts. So we want to use Pennsylvania to be that secondary hub. And so all of this infrastructure has huge impacts on the air, on the quality of air, on the quality of water. Although the science is still very much in development, the kinds of impacts I'm going to talk about have to do with what the red flags are, the concerns about some of these chemicals and increased concentrations of them. So as I mentioned, this report, Plastic and Climate, which is online, was a collaborative effort with the Environmental Integrity Project, who do a lot of, all of these groups are great groups. Environmental Integrity Project has done a lot of work on processing and manufacturing and emissions profiles from those. Our colleagues at Gaia work a lot on incineration. One of the big concerns that we have about plastic is that it is becoming too easy to just simply build incinerators to burn them. And all you're doing then is burning embedded fossil fuels. It just simply becomes a carbon bomb. But increasingly, people are really looking to this as a solution. My colleagues at Gaia have done tremendous work on highlighting the environmental and human health risk associated with incineration. Our colleagues at Five Gyres have also done tremendous work as it relates to water impacts. I'll get to the section on just the ways in which we're finding every day new ways in which plastic degrades our ecosystems, and everything from interfering with the production of phytoplankton, interfering with the natural food chain, because so many of our marine life are now ingesting plastic. This travels up the food chain and becomes on our plates. And my colleagues at Frac Tracker have done a lot of great work on fracking in this region, particularly Western Pennsylvania. And so I do recommend that take a look at their websites if you have any questions about work in those particular stages. The other report that CL was a part of that my colleagues in Geneva worked on was Plastic and Health. This report, again, so much of the science is just emerging. So much of the work that we need to do has to do with convincing our local leaders to invest in research. People are increasingly becoming concerned about the ways in which the cumulative effects of our exposure to plastics, to petrochemicals throughout our lives is having a cumulative effect on our endocrine systems, on male-female fertility, on the health and development of fetuses and children. So I do recommend that report as well. So I'm just going to quickly go through, these look funny, the slides I have here on each of these stages of the process. As I mentioned with hydraulic fracking, particular concerns about the water and the chemicals used in that process rather than just direct vertical fracking, which was the practice for a long time. The ability hydraulic fracking allows us to go much further into bedrock on a horizontal angle by shooting huge volumes of water that contain chemicals that are trade secrets. We do not completely know or understand what is in that chemical or in those chemicals, and we are increasingly concerned that operating under an aquifer can irreparably harm access to clean drinking water for communities that are located or near fracking sites. Again, these ethane crackers, this sort of second stage where that natural gas goes to become part of the plastic feedstocks. Increasingly, we've seen in areas along the Texas and Gulf Coast region what they call Cancer Alley, because the chemicals produced at these facilities are at such high levels. You see very rare forms of cancer among uncharacteristically high percentages of the population. And so you see men and women and children who are not only being diagnosed with cancer at young ages, but they're also proportions of families that all have these same kinds of cancer. So there's some real concerns about compliance these companies have with meeting EPA standards about their emissions. And again, the sheer volume of infrastructure that is being planned for the Ohio River Valley has been a cause of concern. As I mentioned before, the work of my colleagues at Gaia are really concerned that if we do not get a handle on our waste and how we use plastic, that the preferred approach will be to burn it. And as I said, with 90% of plastics being made from fossil fuels, what you're basically doing is just burning embedded carbon. So a big part of the report for CL and looking at climate was that we have made so much progress in terms of moving away from the more dirty sources of electric power and have found new technologies like solar storage that's finally getting to scale, utility scale use, and increase energy efficiency. And there have been all of these tremendous ways that have been cleaner and more beneficial, that this threat, if we don't get our plastic situation in order, really risk all of those gains in environmental integrity if we do not change how we use and interact. Again, this is another photo from the Philippines, Southeast Asia, by virtue of not having the infrastructure to manage the sheer volume of waste that comes over by virtue of trade in materials. It has become particularly catastrophic. Again, we in the United States, by virtue of the infrastructure we do have, despite its imperfections, have been able to largely enjoy an out-of-sight, out-of-mind existence when it comes to trash. For developing countries, the sheer scale of waste is happening far faster than the development of waste infrastructure. So as I mentioned before, our concern with understanding the plastic life cycle is really understanding that these emissions occur from the moment of fracking. You have methane gas that is emitted at the site of fracking. You have the tremendous sources of emissions that come from refining and manufacturing, and that when you take into account the risk of incineration that we worry about when it comes to plastic waste, and then we look at new studies that are showing that, yes, the sheer volume of plastic in our waterways does in fact contribute to some emissions as well, although much smaller than some of the other points in the life cycle. So our health concerns sort of mimic what we know to be true about the emissions profile. So when we look at the early stages, the extraction and transport, you're looking at sort of chemical, and these again, I'm my scientist. I will look to your faces to make sure you don't frown too much, and forgive me if I mispronounce things. But there are three ways in which plastics and their feedstocks and the processes can affect human health. So you start with inhalation, things that can be inhaled that enter in the system, talk about ingestion, and then you talk about dermal exposure. So those three points of entry of these chemicals have been a point of concern. What we do know to be true is that exposure to benzene has particular health impacts on people. We know that you have endocrine disrupting chemicals that impact human health, but they've seen them in isolation. There have not been a lot of studies done on the exposure of those chemicals through plastics, and that's where we really need research on. Because if you know that things like persistent organic pollutants or POPs can have these detrimental and irreversible effects on the human body, you need to understand, we want to understand better how all of this, how our interaction with plastic exposes us to these chemicals and the concentration of those chemicals over time. So again, a big push in a number of states is how do we include this study, more comprehensive study of plastics in our waste stream. So again, as I mentioned, increasingly concerned about the ways in which we are ingesting plastic. If we're looking at a future where by 2050, you're going to see the same amount of plastic as fish, chances are that whenever you get fish, you will be ingesting plastic. This, again, is another concern and another source of how we are exposed to these chemicals and the need to change our relationship with how we use materials made of plastic. So, again, this was another picture. My colleague, Steve Wilson, has been filming a documentary called The Story of Plastic. This particular image is another one from a trip that he made to the Philippines. His description to me is like, Lisa, the pictures don't really capture all of this because it was like your eyes are bleeding with so much plastic in every direction you look and everywhere you go. It's just, this was typical of what he would look at in areas that simply did not have the infrastructure to manage the sheer volume of plastic. And so I would say it was 2017 when China submitted a letter to the World Trade Organization saying, enough is enough. We are placing a ban on certain types of foreign waste, and we will no longer accept it. And that had immediate ripple effects throughout the recycling industry. So much of what you were showing in those charts about the increased price in recycling comes from the fact that in order to be financially viable, there were secondary markets available. China could take our waste, we could sell back some of these recycled materials, they would make products from it, and recyclers could continue to collect trash and operate in an economically viable way. The disappearance of the largest market for secondary materials is having an effect already on recyclers around the world. In the United States in particular, for example, in California, a company called Replanet ran 284 recycling facilities in that state. All 284 closed at the end of August. They said because there were not sufficient subsidies at the state level, because there was no more market for secondary material, they could no longer operate. So there is a real need for supporting subsidies to manage this plastic. There's a real need for understanding and changing our relationship with plastic. And there's a real way in which a number of cities are talking about things like zero waste cities. How do you take, again, an assessment of what do we throw away? What does our waste look like? So some people have focused on single-use plastics. That includes bags. It's amazing how when you just sort of look at your behavior, and I love to see people carrying their own bags. It's so simple, it's so easy, it becomes just a part of what you do, and its benefits are tremendous. You are keeping millions of tons of plastic out of the environment. I think there's not enough that can be said about really looking at oil and gas development, how it's subsidized, how it's encouraged, the amount of environmental degradation associated with the industry, unfortunately, does far more to harm us in detrimental ways irreversibly than for promises of usually very narrow economic gains. When we talk about zero waste communities, I think that's my next slide, but yeah. So implementing more producer responsibility. This is actually a hopeful note, is that you're seeing discussions percolating among brands like Tide, who are like, all right, maybe we need to have refill stations where you bring your jug back to the producer and it doesn't become part of the waste. I mean, if we collected, actually, I like to garden. I'm sorry, this is a little segue. I like to garden, and so my parents like Folgers coffee, and I have them keep their Folger red jugs because it's like, this could be a flower pot. Put some holes in it, give it some drainage, and, you know, and it's silly, yes, but it's one of the ways with like looking at the products we use and rethinking how we use them. Are there opportunities to reuse products? I think I always love stories when people talk about, you know, what happened to the milkman and the milk bottles? We used to have milk bottles picked up and taken away, and we kept them. And I remember going to the grocery store. We wrapped products in paper, and that was perfectly fine. And we didn't need all this cellophane and styrene and other materials. And consumer choice is really moving the ball with a lot of these producers. They're really starting to think about, how do we make our products more reusable? I will also say, too, adopting and enforcing emissions targets and really saying, we're really going to watch our emissions. We really are committed to a climate for our children, our grandchildren, for a future where they can sustain life and can have good lives. Adopting and enforcing those emissions makes us also rethink a lot about the production activities that we do use. So much of the emissions that will come out of plastic production is about producing plastic bags, and there are ways to avoid that. And to encourage emissions also changes the way we allocate manufacturing and production activities that are emissions intensive. Fascinating thing when you look at what is in our waste, and this is a particularly fascinating, I thought it was fascinating, but where our trash comes from, what it is. And you look at the number of sources of materials, and 19.7% is food waste. We could eliminate the amount of waste just by finding a local garden that needs composting, or if you have space for a composter. I got my first composter this year and put it together myself, which was such an ugly undertaking. I'm glad that's not on video, because I'm not very handy. But anyway, I wanted to try it and use it, and it's been an amazing and fascinating experiment. Not so much because I've been able to reap the wealth of black gold that I hope comes out of it at some point. I keep adding stuff, and it takes longer to break down. But anyway, the point is, trash is so much lighter. It's amazing. Those eggshells, the ends of asparagus, the broccoli, or stuff that just didn't make it before we could use it, instead of throwing it out, it goes in the composting bin. It's like, it is astounding. That's part of the story. Again, using your bags, again, using materials. You know, I have a water bottle. This thing has survived many a trip. I've also lost a few, but it's well worth it. I will also say, for those of you who travel a lot, I love this little thing. And, you know, people sell these things online where you can have bamboo utensils. And you think about the amount of plastic we use on airplanes, which is also astounding, and just during the course of travel. But you don't even have to buy one. Just grab a set from your kitchen and just sort of decide, I'm not going to use plastic utensils when I'm out. These things make big decisions cumulatively when we all do them, because it changes then restaurants and how they decide to provide certain materials. For those of you who've seen the change in plastic straws, our relationship with plastic straws. Assigning fees also to plastic bags, to certain utensils. There's a lot of controversy, I know, about assigning fees, but it is incredibly powerful in changing behavior. And it is also a fund to address these issues of waste. So this is the city, from the City of Austin's website, although I'm happy to provide this presentation if folks have interest in any of this. So again, so important to eliminate the incentives, continue to close the information gap. I think there's some wonderful, wonderful materials at the door that Ginny and the League have provided that I just want to remind people of that are on the way out, talking about what is and can be recycled and being mindful about it. And there's also a wonderful League pamphlet all about plastic. So that's at the door. Again, reduce, reuse, and recycle, and continue to fund new research. And for those of you who can make charitable contributions to the Plastic Solutions Fund, there are over, and actually I need to change the slide because there are now 1,600 organizations globally that work on plastics. It's been incredibly powerful and incredibly exciting. People who are getting involved and who are working at all different stages of the plastic life cycle. CL published 4 very brief briefing notes on plastic. It gives some really good research. They're 4 pagers, I think 4 to 8 pagers. Just give really good historical overview about plastics and about how the plastic boom has evolved. I also recommend this book, Susan Frankel. I don't know if any of you saw, there was a good 60 Minutes piece earlier this year on plastic, and they interviewed her, and this is just a very accessible and enjoyable read on plastic, and it's really about her, one woman's relationship to really sort of open her own eyes about plastic use. And just, she said one day she woke up and went into her bathroom and said, "I'm not going to use any plastic today." And after 3 seconds in her bathroom, realized that was absolutely impossible. And so I think it's a wonderful read, but it's also a very wonderful story about sort of mindfulness too. Again, so much of my work, and I'm so grateful for you all to be here and to listen to this today, because sometimes the slog of reading and researching all of this can be very lonely and sort of not very gratifying. So I really thank you all for being here and to sort of help me give this work some life, and to really appreciate the way plastics are connected in so many ways to the kind of environmental degradation and climate degradation we're really looking to avoid. Again, I'm sorry that's in. I was just at the eye doctor this week too, and I kind of feel like this was my last, like, can you read the last line? It was like, no. But I will provide the slides so that their sources of information and other details will be available. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Lisa. That was wonderful. You gave us so much to think about. And I heard her mention she's happy to share her information with people who want to. Just so you know, Radnor Township will be posting this on YouTube. So if you want to go back through their presentation and pick out some of the organizations or their documents that she's mentioned, you can do that on demand on YouTube in the future. We're going to take questions and answers now. And I see my first question, so I'll head into the audience. We're recording it, so we want to hear it on replay.
There are a number of towns, particularly New England, where getting rid of recycling and waste is a net profit center for the town. I lived in Wellesley, Massachusetts before coming back here, and Wellesley last year, which was a bad year for recycling, still had about an $800,000 positive cash flow. And I'm just wondering, do you think for townships like Radnor, Lower Merion, and Tredyffrin, is it feasible to ever have a dump or resource recycling and recovery center that would actually be a net positive cash flow for the townships?
I think that's a really good question. Probably the most important question facing recycling and recyclers is, what are the incentives? How do you look at this business model and reassess how to support recyclers until we can rework this new reality of the disappearance of this largest secondary market? I think it's at a time where the sheer volume of waste being produced is exceeding current capacity. I think it takes a comprehensive view. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think a lot of it has to do with, we're entering a period where, for example, the fashion industry is now looking at ways in, like, how do we develop materials, clothing sustainably? A lot of it is starting to talk about the circular economy, where you give a second life to things. So you're going to start seeing shoes made out of plastic bottles, and you're going to start seeing more products. I think finding an end market and a relationship, whether it's with a company, whether it's with a research institute, being able to build those relationships so you have a market for those secondary materials, and then I think subsidizing it until it can develop a strength, because we all just need to change our behavior, and that includes everything from the producers and manufacturers to how we throw out things. So there's a lot. I would love to see the business model, to see what's working for them, but I'd be very surprised if they didn't have sort of an end user ready to purchase that has been a source of cash flow to keep them sustainable and with a surplus. I mean, that's what everybody wants. I just think it's trying to figure that out is going to be the magic bullet.
I am a gardener, and I'm also part of the Ready for 100, and I also, until last night, raised chickens. Unfortunately, a raccoon now ate the chickens, but besides
Sorry.
that, those of us who can should have a compost pile. It's not that hard, with 19% going to the landfill, which produces methane. It's doubly bad, but I don't know how many people here know that Linvilla Orchards has bought a biodigester, and for less than $200 a year, they'll provide the bucket with the lid, come every other week, pick up your organic waste, give you a bucket, and then at the end of the year, they'll give you X amount of compost. So if you're not inclined to compost, but you do want to get rid of that very heavy, wet, methane-producing thing, it does exist in this area. It's called Mother Compost.
Mother compost.
And it's at Linvilla Orchards.
Linvilla
And
Orchards.
obviously, they're using the remnants for their orchards. And so it's a really nice way to circle through.
That's great.
It's a great suggestion.
I was wondering if you could comment on how likely would it be to get some kind of legislation or policy or regulation in place to have companies that use excessive amounts of plastic for packaging and whatnot. So they're more like RCRA, where they're cradle to grave. It seems like there's so much packaging and things that,
Absolutely.
as an individual consumer, there's not much impact that we can have.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I think that there is, so first there's a movement underway. You'll hear a lot, probably more and more in the future, about the circular economy and about how do you get producers in the private sector more invested, more involved in everything from the amount of plastic packaging you use in your products, but also in the very design of your products. So do you really need the thickness and the amount of plastic in a particular product? I really want to emphasize the amount of consumer power there is when you see products that are overly wrapped. Avoid them. And writing letters is still an incredibly powerful way to hold a lot of companies accountable. So even if you go to, I always tell the story of my mother loves Red Lobster. That's like her favorite place to go for dinner. And I'm sort of the plastic person constantly talking about this stuff to somewhat irritation, but behavior changing activities in my family. And when we go to Red Lobster, and I was saying to her, you know, they took a pledge saying they would not offer straws at their restaurants. And seems like our waiter does, you know, continues to offer straws. Now, I don't want to get any server in trouble, but doesn't hurt to write an email and say, you know, you guys took this pledge, I think it's great, but, you know, and last time we were there, they did not offer straws. And they made it very clear they are available upon request. That's the kind of behavior changing power as a consumer. It may seem like, oh, it's one call, it's one email, but producers really are getting the point that we have reached a crisis stage, that this simply cannot continue. You now have global governance structures that are treating plastic material as a hazardous waste in terms of countries now, developing countries can reject waste under certain circumstances because they can't handle this. There's no amount of investment in waste management infrastructure that can make up for this. And so the big global brands, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Coke, Pepsi, they're starting to come to the table saying, we got to change the way we do things. So I think it's coming.
Hi, thank you for coming and talking.
Thank you for having me.
I'm from the Haverford Environmental Advisory Committee, and there are a number of towns in the area that are in the process of developing or implementing ordinances on single-use plastic bags. Haverford is not doing that. The governor in Pennsylvania has passed or has stopped initiatives on that from townships until next July, I think. Hopefully something will be done on the state level. But we're considering either writing an ordinance that would be a ban on single-use plastic bags in the township from businesses, or charging money for giving them out. If people come and ask for a plastic bag, they need to pay 10 cents or whatever, which is outrageous to people, but
I think that's fantastic.
Probably not
yeah.
that much of a deterrent, actually. What you just mentioned this in passing. What's your experience talking to people and traveling around of this kind of thing working, and what is a better way of approaching it?
It's been a real challenge. I will say another one of the resources, and I don't remember if I've listed it, there's an organization called Surfrider, who their attorney has been incredibly effective in really talking about this tendency for that dynamic you just described, where ordinances are passed at the local level and then you have a state preemption law that gets passed that sort of squashes those lower level. So there are bans on preemption that are model legislation that's also being drafted. But I think it's about persistence, and I think it's becoming more of the trend in so many ways of in order to change that behavior. Those ordinances have been incredibly powerful in keeping thousands of pounds of plastic out of landfills. So again, the Surfrider website has some really good resources with respect to model legislation, what's worked and what's been effective.
I just want to put a pitch in. I hope you all are aware, if you're not. There is an organization called the Energy Co-op. The Energy Co-op not only can give you green or reusable electric power, but also natural gas. There are plenty of companies that will provide renewable electric. They're the only ones providing renewable natural gas. Their natural gas comes from landfills, sewage treatment plants, compost facilities. So you can sign up for this, the Energy Co-op, and you can still get your same PICO or PSE&G bill, and you can go 100% renewable, both your electric and your natural gas. It's quite unique to be able to get natural gas that way. So I highly recommend the Energy Co-op.
Yeah, that's a great recommendation. Also, if you're not aware of it, the state of Pennsylvania operates a website called Power Switch. You can go on there and check offers from electric companies. You can search on price. You can also search for 100% renewable power. So that's a very, very easy thing that you can do. It'll take you about 20 minutes, and that can make a big difference.
So it's pretty evident from just your presentation tonight how broad the problem is, how complex it is, how multifaceted it is. So for an individual who's looking for a way to work to reduce plastics in the environment, what are the 3 or 4 things that you would recommend somebody start with that would give us the biggest return on our investment of time and energy and activism? Is it lobbying? Is it recycling? How would you go about attacking it?
I paused to answer that question just because I feel like different people have different abilities, and so to say, I think it all matters. And so it's sort of like, what does your time, your talent, your ability allow you to do? I think if every single person wrote an email to Procter & Gamble and said, gosh, it would be great if you got on board with this producer responsibility initiative. That's one of those things where you don't know what will happen. There's no silver bullet when you've got a problem this complex. One letter, that for our teacher, what an incredible assignment that would be for a class. Just say, we love this product, but we don't want to see it in a turtle's nose, or just whatever sort of pointed activity. But I think it's incredibly important if you can be a part of the League's activities. It's been wonderful to meet so many committed, nonpartisan individuals who are just like, this is a problem we've got to address. Let's work together to figure it out. So it's really just about, and even if it's just in your own life, just say, I'm going to just try not to use a plastic cup this week. And it's almost not so much, although the volume of plastic that you will have kept out of the landfill, but it's just a good exercise in mindful use of just, wow, could I have brought my own, container? Or like, what did I do? I need to put my container by my keys so I don't forget. It's just, so all of that has ripple effects, incredibly powerful, and is, I just don't think there's any effort that is a waste or not a good investment.
Yeah, I just have 2 comments. I do run a women's group, in our mosque, and what we did, we attended a seminar last year, and I said there is no plastics allowed anymore. Everybody brings your own coffee mug. I'll supply the water, but you just to bring your own in a plastic. So at least, I'm doing single part there to contribute to something. My question is, when we do the single stream, is it effective way of recycling? Because most of the Western countries now, they do have the big bans, have one for glass, one for cans, one for plastic. How does it work in here? Because apparently we dump everything in one place.
I think this goes to the heart of the challenge, is that recycling works in a very uneven manner currently. There's real concern out in California, for example, after the closure of the replant facilities, that it is just all going to go to landfill. I also think that there are ways in which we haven't always held the recyclers accountable. I think there's a lot of instances where probably far more of our plastic goes to the landfill anyway by virtue of contamination, which is not to say that that's their fault, but being clear about, and this is also part of what this sheet is that being clear about what kinds of plastic are actually recyclable. If you put in something that's not going to be recycled, it is going to go to the landfill. And so there are different ways and different processes in recycling. So it's not universal, but I do think for those who are really working towards enhancing recycling practices, being clear about how does it really work, what is really effective, and what do we need to figure out how to make it as economically and financially viable as possible are huge issues. So.
So it's kind of the neoliberal wormhole is like, no plastic straws, or I don't use a plastic bag. But then when you see statistics where it says like the top 100 countries in the world are responsible for, I don't know what it is, 60 or 70% of the carbon footprint, and it's probably the same thing with plastics, the larger impact seems to come from kind of governmental or consumer pressure that you can do. But as a lawyer, like from a legal standpoint, like how difficult of a process is it to try to go at it from, holding those,
Yeah.
what kind of
Yeah.
a huge change would it take?
There are lawyers who are trying to figure out the very question, right? So one of the activities that the Break Free from Plastic Network and a number of Ocean Conservancy as well is something called audits. They're doing these ocean cleanups and they're trying to figure out, is there a way to hold some of these particular producers accountable by virtue of the sheer volume? So you say you've pulled out a ton of plastics. If you find that sort of 25% of that is Coca-Cola, can you hold them 25% accountable for environmental degradation under whichever jurisdiction's laws and rules? So people are trying to figure that out. I think the risk or the threat of liability is something that's also motivating producers to we need to get in front of this. I think that there's a general movement towards sustainability, that people are realizing that with the environmental changes that are afoot, that simply dealing with the effects of contamination and degradation, that people are likely going to be held accountable for a much broader set of activities that include the conduct. So people are trying to figure out, companies are trying to figure out, environmental lawyers are trying to figure out, what is the push and the impetus going to be? I think to your point about the disparities, under international law, it's common but differentiated responsibilities, recognizing this difference between developed countries, where we use a huge volume of the resources, versus developing countries that is why this situation is as bad as it is, because they have not developed at the same speed or rate, and yet you had this trade practice where it was an opportunity for them to be able to take this secondary material and have an economy that came from giving a second life to those materials. It's just that the waste they couldn't use far outpaced the infrastructure. So in terms of part of being in a capitalist country, it's amazing how the markets can move decisions, and that's why I am such a big proponent of consumer voice, because at the end of the day, everybody wants their market share, and if their market share means consumers like buying the less packaged items, and the consumers like buying the company that wants to be part of the solution of reusing a laundry jug, then they'll have bigger market share. So again, complicated issue, lots of different points of entry, but I do think it's all of these particular pieces are evolving in the same direction.
So just a reference, not a question. If you're looking at practicing and what you can do, if you go to ecochallenge.org, ecochallenge.org, they have a variety of challenges you can do. I've done 2 plastic challenges this year. They run 26 days to 30 days, and they have wonderful education materials on the different things you can do to help you out as individuals. If you want priorities, which I heard a couple questions on, go to drawdown.org, which has done research and lists the 100 things that need to be done by 2050 to permanently reduce greenhouse gas production.
Thank you. That's great.
I think you touched on really my question, which was really around the economics. So it seems, just more of a commentary at this point, that we have a situation where you have producers who are generating revenue by producing plastics, but then it really seems to be analogous to many of the toxic dumping situations we saw with EPA and others, where then the societal cost of bearing the brunt of that production is falling to the rest of society and causing things, for example, cancer and so on. So just thinking about the economic impacts of both the benefits, but they seem like they're tremendously outweighed by the cost. It would seem logical that you'd want to shift the cost back to the producers. And so it sounds like that's where people are looking currently. Is that right?
That's beautifully said. I think that really producer responsibility, and again, I think it's about benefits and opportunities too, because I think if they did look at their whole manufacturing processes, that there would be opportunities that do serve them. And I am encouraged by this way in which talking about environmental externalities very differently. It's like, how can we start to incorporate it more as being like, this is a cost of business. This will impact your market share. This is not just something you can pretend will be disappear or managed or not that bad or something you can buy your way out of in a certain way, but that it really becomes the cost of doing business in a meaningful way.
My question sort of follows him, and that's the whole issue of environmental justice. So we have 2 trash to steam plants in this area. One is in Chester, and one is in Plymouth Township, which is, they're both seriously affecting the areas where they're located, and it's pretty obviously they're located where getting the land and building it didn't cost very much. So how are we going to handle that? Radnor's trash, I've been told now, all goes to the Covanta plant in Chester and is burned. But the ash will go to the landfill. Well, in the 90s, I was involved in the Cayenne Sea, which was when Philadelphia's ash that was labeled toxic was dumped on the beach in Haiti. And we spent a long time getting it off the beach of Haiti. Ultimately, it was dumped in the Indian Ocean. But it was just a perfect example of first world to third world. And it's a hard issue. But we only live about 8 miles from the Covanta plant, and when the wind blows the right way, we're getting the fumes too. So it's another piece that, in my mind, we can't ignore.
I agree.
I get discouraged thinking, and I don't know if I'm right or not, but if we get a handle on our plastic consumption in this country and we're just not buying as much, those manufacturers are going to keep wanting to make the same amount of money they always have. So they'll just sell it to the less developed nations that are much less equipped to deal with it. It seems like as far as, climate change and everything else, we're not really going to make a dent by changing our behavior. I mean, we'll make a dent in the trash that's laying around, but...
So 2 things I want to say. First is, don't get discouraged. Which is, trust me, working on climate is far from a joyful activity every day, particularly when it looks like we're going in the wrong direction and the impacts are very dire. I am amazed, since I have started this work in 2017, how much has changed. I mean, you can't go anywhere where somebody isn't talking about plastic straws in some way, shape, or form. It could be their outrage, like, what did plastic straws ever do to anybody? To people being like, I don't need it. My lips work fine. So you're seeing dramatic, and this has been in just, 2 years? I mean, I firmly believe in the power of change. I know that so much of what we do can seem so small and so incremental, but has ripple effects. And it is, when I say that the big companies, the Unilevers and so forth, they are paying attention. They are paying attention. If you feel like CNBC did a report earlier this year about the when all of the 10Ks, the annual reports for all of the publicly traded companies come out, you're going to see, it used to be the sustainability comments were sort of maybe something that was a pamphlet, and now it's sort of much more a part of the business operations. And because a lot of the big institutional investors that are shareholders say, this is important, you need to address this. It is a complicated, cumulative, and I just believe that every little bit helps. Every little bit helps. You just, You know, somebody may just watch you not use a plastic bag and say, oh, I could do that. You know, it's just, we just don't always know what our impact will be on things, so don't think of it as a small thing.
No, I'm just concerned about what's going to be happening in other parts of the world that
And that is fair, because there are ways in which developing countries are looking for products. There's also this big issue with the medical industry. Medical facilities use tremendous amounts of plastic, and it's all for health and safety and so forth. The bigger issue is about if there are ways that we can become more efficient and more effective and more discerning about what is plastic, that we can manage this volume. And you're right. There is a huge need for better infrastructure, so this does not look like the entire, you know, every coastal. But it's going to take time. But I do believe that every little bit helps.
I echo that. Any other comments or questions from the crowd here tonight? All right, well, thank you all for coming out and for sticking around. And like I said, this will be up on YouTube in a day or two. So if you want to revisit any of the information, you're able to do that quite easily. Lisa, thank you so much
Thank
for
you for
coming
having
here
me.
tonight. It was
Thank
a
you.
great talk.
Such
We
good
appreciate it.
questions.
Thank you, everybody.